consciousness does not die, immortal and divine. We're all divine and we're all creative. So to know that is what in every age we need to remember in order to be and as creative as we can be.
So I understand what you're saying. You know, it all kind of like makes sense. And I've come to this realization a little bit over the years, but really explain what you mean by the fact that we're immortal. Like my body dies, right? I could easily say, how am I immortal? I die.
Yes, the body does, because the body is, as one quantum theorist said, the body is what matter, what spirit looks like in the physical world. You might say that when we come into the world, when we are born into the world, our soul, our spirit coagulates into this heavy matter, which is the body. And the soul then, when it spirals out of the body, leaves that matter to return to the earth, you might say, but the consciousness, everything that is the creative force, returns to the source, which is that immortal, infinite, divine, creative presence.
So do you have any good metaphors for that? Like, because of course, like explaining that is just very difficult to understand. I mean, actually the metaphor that I come up with, if we're talking about the Lion King, is the circle of life, you know, like Mufasa goes to Simba. We are lions at the moment, but when we die, we become the grass and the antelope eat the grass. So even though we eat the antelope, this consciousness, this self, this spirit is always being moved and transformed. And well, I think moved is a great word, throughout the, we'll say, world.
You know, if we look at it in the way that now quantum physics helps us to see, it is that consciousness exists. It is primary. It exists before matter. You know, the old science had it wrong. They said matter, there's only matter. There's nothing but matter. And oops, what do you do about the consciousness? Oh, well, that's just an epiphenomenon of matter. Somehow matter just accidentally excretes consciousness, I guess. Well, that just doesn't make any sense. But now, through quantum physics, which is finally coming full circle to more of a fullness of what science has always tried to be, and that is an understanding of the whole of creation, then it's very clear that consciousness is primary. It exists. If there's no matter in the universe, consciousness exists. But consciousness can do nothing but create. We are very creative. And so it will create in a heavier, you might say, form, matter. And we can play all kinds of games together, you know, and experience all kinds of things. We can be the grass, we can be the lion, we can be humans, we can be whatever. Consciousness is all of it. But like right now, you and I are in a human body. And so we're going to create out of that particular form. But the consciousness that created this body is eternal. And there's so much evidence for that now.
So how exactly does quantum physics support that? I don't know much about quantum physics.
Well, and I can't tell you either well with quantum physics, but I will say that in terms, they would be able to do that. But I can say that they, especially the ones that have a greater understanding of what quantum physics is about, is that it's very clear that it is consciousness that is primary and it creates matter. That's a complete difference from the old science. But I'll tell you why we had such a limited science in a few minutes. But in terms of experience, there is so much experience now. For instance, the actual death, you might say, experience. They're called near-death experience. I mean, millions of people have had those experiences of being in another dimension of reality and knowing all kinds of things they couldn't know. For instance, very often they know what's going on the other side of the world at the very time that they're dead, flatliner. And for instance, one man was a flatliner, dead, pronounced dead.
Mhm.
And then he did come back. They were able to resuscitate him. He knew everything. This is a very typical story. He knew everything that had happened, everything everybody had said while he was a flatliner. And then he said also, he was out of his body. He went various places, and where he went, what he said happened. Actually, they checked it out. It did happen. And he said, and by the way, up on the, I think maybe the 7th floor of the hospital, outside that window, there's a little pair of red tennis shoes. He said, I just happened to see it. Well, they checked, there they were.
Wow.
So now this is, there is so much evidence of that kind. Millions of people have experienced that. And it's, some people say, well, they just, for this reason or that reason. But basically it boils down to the fact they're dead, no brain activity whatsoever,
Yeah.
and they are able to have these experiences. So that's pretty good evidence that there is something that is not dependent upon the physical body to live.
So explain what that means. Obviously, you wrote a whole book on that. It's the miracle of death, and explain exactly what the miracle of death is, and really what happens to ourselves after we die.
Well, the miracle in it really, miracle is a word for something that exists, that happens, but our science doesn't explain. Our science just isn't up to knowing how that happens. But in 1990, in 1990, my mother was hit by an automobile and killed instantly. And then 1 year later, our son, our only child, Pishti, was in another car accident, and he was actually probably dead when the paramedics picked him up, but they took him to the hospital, and he was in intensive care for 13 days and then died. And then 2 years later, my husband was in his native country, Hungary, and he was killed in a car accident. But after our son was killed, my husband and I had many experiences with his consciousness. Now, I have to tell you that my husband was not, he was interested, but not much in that kind of thing. And I had spent my life teaching mythology, which, the old joke is mythology is somebody else's religion, but it's these symbolic spiritual symbols of various groups of people. And also I'd gone to Peru to work with shamans. So I was very interested, but, and he would somewhat listen, but he had kind of a hard time with it. As a matter of fact, when I came back from Peru, I was trying to tell him about an experience I'd had there. And I could tell he wasn't really paying attention. When I called his attention to that fact, he said, it's true. I know that what you're telling me is true because I know you, but I have never had any experience like that. And I don't even know how to relate to it. Well, I think that is an honest description of what most people, are experiencing, because we're born into a culture, the only major culture that has denied the existence of anything beyond matter. So it wasn't until, I think maybe it was a week before Pishti, our son, was in the accident, he actually had a vision. In his office here at home, he suddenly saw Pishti's car on the side of the freeway, and he saw Pishti's body superimposed on it. Wow. And he knew he was dead because there were two different dimensions there. And then he heard himself say, oh, that's right, Pishti. It's almost time for you to do this. That shocked him. And then Pishti in the vision answered, and he said, that's right, Dad. I'll be out of the house for a little while.
Wow.
And he went, then Ishvan was completely unconscious of it. He didn't remember it. And we both happened to be home the afternoon that, and that was kind of unusual that we would both be home that day. We were both going somewhere in different directions, but we were there when the call came through. And that's when Istvan told me later, after Pishti died, he said the vision then came back, and he was convinced that he wouldn't live, but he would try to make himself believe he might during those 13 days. Yeah. But then when I look back at my dream journals, I saw that for 2 years I had been dreaming of his death. Really? And yeah, 2 years. But I would think, oh, that wasn't Pishti. That was someone else's son. And yet I grieved in those dreams and I kept dreaming it. I was so glad I had recorded those dreams, but I looked at them symbolically. And then, of course, what was really very impressive to me was that when Pishti was not quite 12, he used to tell me his dreams and I'd encourage him to write them down. And one afternoon I was vacuuming and he came in, he said, "Oh, Mom, I really had a big dream last night," because he just remembered it. He said, "Would you write it down?" I said, "Yes." I realized later he had written it down and also had drawn it. So this was the dream. He said, I was in a trauma center and I was up above the hospital looking down at my dead body in an operating room. Well, of course, he was in an operating room. He was in intensive care. And his body really was dead, actually, because he had severe brain damage, but they were keeping him alive on machines.
Yeah.
And then he said there was just a dark period. And then I was on the other side and I was in like a horseshoe. He said, I was at the top of the horseshoe and there were 4 boys to my left, 4 boys to my right. There was an eternal flame in the center. And on the other side of that, there was an aura of the 10th boy. And I knew we were all waiting for him to arrive. And when he arrived, I knew I would be complete because 10 is a number of completeness. And then he said, "What do you think that means, Mom?" Oh, Lord. And so I was concerned because he even drew where the hospital bed was, where the wash basin was in the room. And when I went in that day, when we arrived, it was exactly that.
No.
Yeah, it was exactly what he had drawn.